Well, hello everyone. I'm Samantha. On behalf of Makuho and the session presenters, I'd like to welcome you to today's session. I'm going to drop the link to the evaluation form in our chat. That way you can fill it out at any point or take the last 5 minutes of the session to fill it out. Without further ado, here is Brian Medina presenting Addressing Hate Bias.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's lovely to be with you all. Again, as I was just sharing in terms of precursor for folks is, as folks are signing on, if you wanted to introduce yourself, your name, your pronouns, maybe what institution you represent, you can certainly share more than that if you like. Feel free to do that in the chat. That's why we have that open to folks. But we do want this to be an engaging opportunity while I'll be mostly kind of presenting content, I'll admit, and then throughout prompt some reflective questions that you can either share with one another. We can certainly talk and engage. I'll make sure that there's an open Q&A at the end. Acknowledging that for some folks, this is brand new stuff. And for other folks, you've had a hate bias team and you've been running for 25 years, so, and everywhere in between. So the hope is that this session can kind of hit on all points, some really key aspects for what you consider within a team, consider when anything hate bias response. So I do want folks to acknowledge that this space is meant kind of as a general overview. And if you have specific questions about your campus, about the needs that you're trying to see for your students and for your staff, then I'm happy to stick around after for the Q&A, but also I'll make sure that my contact information is there at the end so that folks that may have some interest to connect offline, online, to be able to do that as well. So again, was introduced. My name is Brian Medina. My pronouns are Z, here, and here's. I currently work as the Program Manager of Bias Incident Support Services, that's a mouthful, at the University of Maryland, College Park. And unforeseen a few years ago, I'm actually out of residence life. And so for me, seeing this from kind of an outside window now than what I'd previously done for about 13 years within housing and residence life, I hopefully bring in a kind of different perspective, but also a lot of resonance with the work that you do every day. So as I go throughout this, I'll certainly hope to hear how your own experiences shape the way that you address hate bias incidents as well. So I purposely leave this slide a little open-ended. I was thinking I was just going to add some content. But I think with much of anything that this year has brought us, it is different based on the individual, based on the community, based on the campus, based on your identities. And so I say 2020, the year that was, I kind of invite you, and whether you share that in the chat or just kind of reflect upon it for yourself, what this has meant for you, what has been the impact on you, what has been the impact of your students. There are far-ranging answers to that question. I feel compelled, it's not compelled, I choose to name Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, and just last night, Marcellus Stinnett was shot and killed right outside of Chicago at a police stop. And naming them and the hundreds of others, Black and brown folks who have been shot and killed, others who have been shot by vigilante justice, that for folks in this space, as we talk about hate bias, I would be remiss if I didn't share that that is the precursor to all the work that I do, is centering Black folks, that it's no longer just a moniker and a label I put on a Facebook post or on my background, but it really is a call to action for all of humanity. And certainly it's my purpose in this work. And so I say 2022 it was, yes, pandemic is absolutely front of mind for a lot of us, but for me, before that is the 400 or plus years of systemic oppression. That one singular year is now exemplifying some of what that looks like in terms of disproportionately impacting folks. So again, that's for me, but I welcome you again in the chat, in your own reflection, either your own writing behind the scenes, or sharing with your staff what 2020, as we reflect on this year in the months to come, it'll be important for us to process this, especially as we're hitting elections soon as well. All right, but I'll jump a bit into the content. So I want to give you a quick outline. I want to also add some color, my nice pride flag in there. So I'll talk a little about campus context, ask you some of these prompted questions, whether you share in the chat, whether you just are reflecting for yourself. What does it mean to compose a hate bias team? How do you report your hate bias incidents currently, and how could you in the future? What are some protocols that you have in place, either formally or informally? How do you respond to folks? What's a bias dashboard? We have now seen in our campuses a lot of COVID dashboards, but what's a bias dashboard? I'm going to be sharing some resources here for folks, but also invite you to share your own. If there are links, if there are files that you want to share, to do that. And then we'll leave some time for Q&A as well. So first, for some questions. As you ponder and reflected upon it, I'm sure that as you enter into this space and wanted to attend this session, you were thinking about your own current team or your own way in which hate bias response has maybe changed in this last year, or maybe you've been more attentive to this because folks have brought this to your attention of here's this glaring omission that I want to see. And so similar to my outline, it's really asking these questions of yourself. Who is on your team? If you have a team, which most do, but not everybody does, who comprises that team? Who are the key stakeholders? And how did you invite them into that team? And who are some folks maybe to consider to add to them in the future? Or who are maybe folks that are outside that team in the direct sense that you meet regularly, but then other folks that maybe you contact as resources? How do folks submit and refer hate bias reports currently? There's some that go simple referral through email or drop into an office or a phone call. Others who have a form in place in some formal, Maxient or Simplicity or some other form. Others who have gone the extra step in actually putting hate bias reporting at the front of their website. That is, something to be able, not necessarily be proud of, but to say, folks, here's an accessible resource for you. So again, how do you refer folks? How do folks submit these reports? What is within those reports? What are the protocols and procedures? How do your staff members, who responds to what after hours, in the moment, but then afterwards, what does that follow-up look like? How are you centering folks that are impacted by hate bias? How do you communicate this to the community? And what I mean by community is not just your campus community, but to larger communities. So how do you share with your staff? What is the information you share more probably in private? What are things within your hate bias response team that may know? What are some folks that maybe on campus need to know some information? And then broadly, if you receive complaints or concerns from parents or alumni or outside stakeholders, what does that communication look like? And then ultimately, what further resources do you need to advance what the work that you are doing? This is assuming that we all can make improvements. We're not all there with all of this stuff. And the hope is that we can then share in this session and beyond to ensure that you are supported and this community can be there for you. All right, so again, whether you want to participate in the chat, connect with each other, that's entirely up to you, but it's just an invitation, not an expectation. So I start first with building teams. I'll be honest with you, as I was preparing this session, I was thinking of how do I really frame the conversation? And I really want to show that and demonstrate that this is a team. My work, and just for some exposition about my work, I am a one-person team within the Bias Incident Support Services. Currently, I had previously a supervisor, she left. We're hopefully getting a new director of my office. But that for a lot of campuses, your team doesn't have somebody solely dedicated to hate bias response. There may be derived from a student conduct office or from residence life to really manage this. And so to have somebody kind of in my role, that's a pretty rare exception to most of the norm within at least our region. So how do you build a team? If you haven't already built a team, maybe it's taking steps forward, but also for the team that you have, how do you develop that team? How do you make sure that that's augmented over time? So some of the key members, and this is just kind of a listing of things for me to share of what I think, certainly we can add to this list. But if you're not involving whatever equivalent, diversity, inclusion, multicultural, social justice, LGBT center, all the things that our offices may have resourced to us, please do so. Oftentimes what I've talked to and friends in the field within residence life and housing is that diversity and inclusion offices may be hearing about these things after the fact, or maybe they hear from their marginalized students directly and then they refer, but they're not necessarily in the decision-making situations. I encourage you to invite them, me ultimately, to ensure that we are centering those marginalized folks first, and that indeed, yes, we're following protocols, but that the centering of this is about humanity and those who are harmed. Residence life, of course, most of you on this chat, training the staff, responding to incidents after hours. For a lot of you, this is a day in, day out struggle and challenge of how do you keep that work-life balance? How does your staff really maintain themselves? But your influence in a team like this is so important and ingratiated into how everybody has a pulse on the ground of what's going on. Counseling center, I think it goes without saying that we all could use a little bit of extra support and therapy. We can all, in terms of referrals, not just say a counseling center is there for you and here's their contact information, but here's a soft, warm handoff, ensuring that a student who's experiencing this, or even a staff or a faculty who's experiencing hate bias, knows that there are professionals on campus there for them. And I know that they're often tapped, more so even now, virtually is very difficult, but our counseling center folks definitely are a good resource. Student conduct or equivalent. Sometimes student conduct is embedded within residence life, sometimes its own separate office, but that navigating the policies, the student rights and responsibilities, the accountability measures. Often when folks experience hate bias situations for themselves, they're asking, well, what's the results? What's going to be the outcome? And often we can't tell them up front because there is a process, but at least knowing that the student conduct office is in a part of this team, hearing the situations at play, and not just hearing it as a one-for-one caseload, but seeing what are the trends that are going on campus? How can I really inform my team to ensure that our policies are fair and equitable? Title IX or equivalent, some folks use Office of Civil Rights, Title IX, that distinguishing where, especially more recently with recent POTUS decisions, that gender and sexual orientation, it's not just that Title IX protects gender, sexual orientation for trans students are also protected. And so there's some need for at least a communication, if not an inclusion of Title IX into that team in order to navigate who takes this on. It can't be that 10 partners chat with folks and then folks get really confused as to who they're responding to. Police and campus safety, I will admit on the side that this is a bit controversial for some folks, that having police involved in these conversations on the outside for a lot of our marginalized student representation can feel a little bit disarming, can feel that as institutions, as teams build together, do we really want police involvement, especially in the movements of defunding the police or at least deconstructing what are the police purposes? I still find it beneficial to have them at the table as partners. I think it's essential for them to understand and know where the sensitivity needs to come in communicating, especially students of color, LGBT students, international students, when they're experiencing hate bias incidents, how police can really be a front line. Hey, how can we do some community policing and not just response policing? How can we make sure we're ingratiating ourselves into the very fabric as means for peace order rather than just police order? Again, of course, they also do criminal investigation. So when it comes to a hate crime, you need to have them involved. Marketing or comms equivalent, PR, whomever might be on your team, that having those internal and external messaging. What are the folks sharing internally to departments or to staff or faculty as you're experiencing these situations? But also, how are you navigating those outside partners? What if the local media picks up a story from a student on your campus or from off campus? Maybe in the case for me several years ago, where an attempt of a white student union happened at a campus I belong to. How do you manage that? How do you acknowledge that there is a student group who is premised on hate, their entire foundation, but then how does your marketing team really navigate that from the outside in? And they can be very useful for that. Some extras that I share are some advocacy groups. So I have the fortune of having a CARE to Stop Violence team, which are all premised on stopping violence, particularly for sexualized violence, gender-based violence. But the hope is that the teams that you might have as advocates, maybe even student groups, can be an ally. And then faculty affairs or HR, this really just depends on your campus dynamic. Having faculty in on some of these conversations, even if at least on the peripheral, is helpful. And human resources, if it becomes something where discrimination from a faculty member to a junior faculty or from a staff to a student, what does that look like when it comes to HR's involvement? So they're a little bit extra. That's where I don't have them on my team, but I think it's important to have them at arm's length in case you need to reach out to them for support. So again, I invite you, and maybe I'll take a few moments here because this is really where the premise of this session is about, is how some of the makeup of your teams maybe engage in some dialogue, and you can put yourself off mute to be able to share what is it that you're encountering with your teams, how does your team maybe function, and maybe a little bit of open Q&A now of where some suggestions might be from one to the other of how your team can function better.
My name is Audrey Burkett. I'm from Davis Elkins College in West Virginia. I actually I work full-time in residence life and full-time in student life because we're very small. And so my main job is I see and deal with all of the conduct incidents on campus. So I serve with our care team as well as our preliminary response team, which deals with all that stuff, as well as our drug and alcohol prevention teams and things like that. Because of my role in conduct, currently we do not have a hate bias response team that sort of is lumped into our current teams, but we do not have any people of color serving on those teams at this time. And so I think that's where we can benefit. We did, because of current events, we have added a diversity and inclusion coordinator or director So that is starting on campus, and I think that maybe we could venture into that. But we do deal with our hate bias incidents. We just deal with them and lump them in with our normal conduct incidents and conduct reporting and things like that. We do have individuals who do Title IX and also just HR or normal complaints or incidents on campus. We have separate reports for those, but like I said, we don't really have anybody specifically who is geared towards this. And I think that we could definitely benefit from having that, because we do have a very high athlete population on our campus, which does include a lot of individuals who are of color and also international students. And so this is something I think we're really lacking in, and we can benefit from that and just overall training in general.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for taking that brave first leap of sharing. So I'll have some shared thoughts for you, Audrey, but in the chat, if there are other folks that want to participate, and first thank Audrey for sharing. If there are any things that maybe from your own navigation of working with, it seems like, Audrey, you have so many responsibilities lumped in, not only with your own role, but within the teams that you have currently exist, that it can sometimes feel overwhelming that if you encounter many of these circumstances, while there is some common protocols, and that's good to at least have a core group that are really trusting each other to support students and folks that are encountering these things, that also having some dedicated time aside. And so maybe, one recommendation would be, if as amongst your team, if let's say you meet weekly or bi-weekly or whatever the rotation is, that you spend some time in those off weeks, or in, maybe if you're meeting weekly, that maybe there's some time at the end to really center in what does it look like for us if we would encounter. Some of it's maybe some roundtable conversations, what we call tabletop scenarios, that folks, let's just pretend, I hope this doesn't happen for your campus, but let's say a white supremacist group comes to your campus and marches in the streets around the campus as folks are also trying to go to the polls on the 3rd or even before then. What would you engage if indeed your students are feeling intimidated for voter intimidation, if your students are of color feeling intimidated because maybe there's a public forum where these folks have technically license to be able to share some of their beliefs for First Amendment protections, but they're also showing some intimidation. So how do you protect those students, even if it's not a hate crime, that for folks to feel protected by the institution? That it might be just an exercise you go through and allowing your team to understand that it's not just, I separate somebody going through a conduct situation around drugs or alcohol and responsibilities from somebody who's experiencing trauma and pain based on their identities. They're very different circumstances. I mean, most of us wouldn't equate supporting folks through sexual violence work as saying the same as, again, a violation of quiet hours, right? They're such divergent situations about policies versus entire dignity of humanity. And so as you navigate that, Audrey, and I'm happy to liaison with you off of this session to help in not only training folks, but also to really centering, how can we do this in a way that, yes, we have a lot on our plates, but make sure that we have the language of checking in, ensuring that folks feel heard, validating emotions in ways that maybe you wouldn't have to think about as much. Obviously, you want to do that generally, but as much as you would maybe for addressing a policy violation outside of that. Is anybody else willing to share?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been focusing a lot on, in addition to bias incidents as they relate to the residence halls, are general policies and who are we centering and how are we centering them. I think we constantly go back and forth when we look at our on-call policies around where do we balance areas where we're mandated to report in some type of way, right? While also giving the autonomy to students. I think we see this often with hate crimes in the context of our policy prior to was, regardless, we would call the police, right? Like immediately to take pictures and to get that information. And I think we're starting to have some conversations on what exactly is necessary as regards to our Clery obligations, right? And how do we put that power back into the students, into their decision, into their journey. And so, I mean, I think that's something that we think a lot about. One of the things that our director of diversity education, who is phenomenal, constantly pushes us on is what about in the moment? I think we do bias incidents equal vandalism, and that's not necessarily true. And so I think we have a pretty good understanding what it looks like for vandalism, but in terms of education and training and development for our student staff and our professional staff when someone says something that is harmful or violent, or they see something in the act, like what do we do with that, and what do we do with the community, and when do we acknowledge harm, right, and to the community, and what are those different ways? And so I think those are the things I think a lot about what do we do in the moment, and then what do we do after the healing circle or after the bulletin board or what have you, right? And so those are just a lot of thoughts I have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Charlotte. My immediate reaction is thank you for starting to explore how the roles, and this is really for your RAs too, what are the roles of an RA? What are the roles of a hall director? What are the roles of a police in responding to all sorts of situations? I think more and more in recent years, we've come to acknowledge that survivors of gender-based violence or power-based violence, that we're not an immediate call to the police because of what that triggers for them, that they may not choose to have that as a report that they want to have. You know, if they can be empowered to make that decision, to support them in that decision, but they may seek counseling, they may seek some support from their RA because they have that trusting relationship, but not to immediately jump to, hey, a police report is needed here. And trying to also reframe that with police and trying to acknowledge that they're in the struggle of like, well, it's a crime. Sexual violence is a crime. Yes, we acknowledge that, but how do we empower folks to be able to make that decision? We still have reporting measures we have to say to the Title IX coordinator, but we don't necessarily have to involve the police. Similarly, and I'm not saying they're one for one, I think the impact is so different based on the individuals, based on the gravity and the egregiousness of the act. Nonetheless, the impact of the individuals for different identities, for sexual orientation, for different religious groups, international students, folks of color, why are we separating this out as if folks of varying genders and for sexual violence is that much different truly in terms of one's sentimentality of, I'm feeling violated, I'm attacked. My very essence and nature is being invalidated by the institution by not allowing me to be who I am. Even though, broadly speaking, we may say that we include everybody, but how are we demonstrating that? And so I'm really thankful, Charlotte, for you to say that investigating how a police officer really should even be excluded from these calls. I'll be honest, nowadays, we don't involve police. Our Res Life team, my team, doesn't involve police unless it is egregious, unless we feel like there's a threat to, physical harm to a community, and we want them to be on standby because we know we kind of anticipate a protest coming up, and we want to have police kind of on the outskirts, not involved, not kind of de-escalating situations as readily with guns they might have, but to be on the outskirts as needed. If we feel like it's getting awry, we can call upon them, but they don't just act because they want to. And that's even a dicey situation because some of the protests are Black Lives Matter and Black Terps Matter. So for us, it's how do we even keep them at even further length because they have, lovingly I say this, they've been part of the problem too. So again, going back to your own protocols, your procedures, asking the very deep and hard questions that allow you to really center, and I'm glad that you use the terminology, Charlotte, of centering folks, the marginalized folks, acknowledging the harm, the impact, that as you follow up, it's not just a circle. A restorative circle or a bulletin board are great. They're wonderful, maybe shortly thereafter circumstance, but what's the ongoing follow through? What's making sure that those folks that are experiencing harm are not re-experiencing it a month, 2 months, a semester later, and then saying their college experience at a certain school has been now entirely framed by this reference of feeling discriminated against. For sake of time, I am going to kind of continue us on, but be thinking about, I want us in the Q&A, if there are other thoughts that folks that want to share, to be welcome to do that. You may have some other challenges you want to present at different angles, and maybe some of the materials that I share will help with that. So I have kind of like a bonus edition on the next slide. And that's something that not many campuses, again, some of us don't even have dedicated hate bias response teams. To have a student advisor group, that's way not possible yet. But it's something to explore. It's something to consider. One of the things that I found very beneficial, this is the first year that my office had, first full year, have a student advisor group, and I meet with them monthly. It was something they applied. They don't get paid for it. It'd be lovely to pay them, but it's more of as a volunteer, as an advocate, as a co-conspirator, as accomplice, you want to be a part of the struggle to address these situations. And so I share some of the purpose, some of the background of why we did this. Having students as advocates, change agents, I think that there's something to say, especially for somebody who's experienced a bias incident, maybe their first year, now as a junior, wants to give back and wants to see the system change. This is a tangible way to do that. How do you maybe frame in what my job is or what the hate bias response team does. So I meet with, again, the hate bias response team as staff every 2 weeks, the student advisor group every month. The every month conversation then is a precursor to the hate bias response team just the night before. So they're informing our work. They're giving us agenda items to explore, even some considerations. Advisory group is really that, is to say, we want to make sure from a student's perspective, we have a voice in the decisions that come. And they may not change all the policies perhaps, but at least they're able to navigate, hey, these policies are unclear, or maybe the way that you're centering folks, you're not using this method or these words that are really helpful. You're not acknowledging the trends, kind of thinking about what's happening on campus. I'm hearing this, and this now, of course, much more so online. How are you then centering those folks in an online space and making sure you're providing training? How do you interrupt Zoom bombing? How do you interrupt social media attacks with memes? How do you do that without students then informing you here are the settings that they're actually most engaged? Open communications, peer-to-peer. So I'm starting to work with, again, this is the first year, so I'm trying to be gentle about it, but seeing if there's some folks on my team that maybe into the spring want to actually teach this stuff with me, kind of as a collaborator. I'm the professional, so I'm getting paid to do this, but as a student, this can be a wonderful opportunity for them to have voice. And frankly, a lot of their peers are going to appreciate their perspective and their centeredness in that space. And so them sharing with a training, maybe with some marketing, they share amongst their own networks, and that's helpful. Adding some credibility. So I want to be cautious about how I frame this, because adding credibility is not a sense, and I acknowledge that my identity is as a Latinx queer professional, but still passing as a white man, is itself challenging for a lot of folks of color, women of color who come into the space. And so adding credibility is not a way for me to use Blackness as a shield, because therefore I'm not addressing my own racism. I am still doing that every day. I'm still addressing my own, all the phobias and isms that I have to in order to center students that I support. Nonetheless, there's credibility in doing this as a team, especially students that are then finding relationship, because often folks are coming into these spaces for the first time, reporting an incident, and they have no context of who you are. But if their friend who happens to be on the advisory group or knows somebody that could be in the advisory group, that adds an entirely different layer where somebody says, I trust my friend, who, by the way, has built rapport with Brian, or fill in the blank person, in order for me to know that this process is meant for me, is not meant for just what a lot of folks perceive as we're reporting this so that folks can then have it as a tracker, or we're trying to CYA for our campus and address it, but not actually address the systemic isms that are there. The whole hope is that this group, a student advisory group, could serve in that capacity to really add and lend student voice and credibility to all of what we do. And then my last point was to develop students. You might find that some of the students become RAs, become RDs, become folks in the field, maybe want to do D&I work long term. I actually have somebody who I'm hiring as a grad next week who had some of this work in their undergrad and now is being able to serve further with me at another campus in order for this to be maybe something they consider long term. And so for me, I can't think that we are only here in the moment, but also thinking long term, as our student development theory tells us to do, to ensure that as they're going on to grad school or beyond, that they have support and means for which they can get this practice. So again, I say team, hate bias response team is one, this is another team. So I'm going to go through a little bit more quickly some of the things that I have put together with forms and protocols and resources, largely because I want to set aside time at the end for more questions. All of this, all these materials, of course, are going to be, they're recorded right now, but also they're going to be provided at the end. I want to make sure that this is a resource for you, but it's not the heaviest part of this conversation. These are all just, again, added bonuses for folks. So one thing I did want to note with this is that it's important for you, for any campus, to make it very visible and obvious when folks are reporting. For me, it's right front and center on our Office of Diversity Inclusion website. Anybody can see that. We actually want to make it on the main page. It's not something, and I know for a lot of PR folks are like, oh, we don't want to flag that, but folks are going to be eager to know how to get this resource to be able to report an incident. And so having that front and center is very helpful. It says that you care about those folks that are impacted more than anything else. So again, this is just kind of walking through the form that I created. I use Maxient for this, but whatever services, if you have just a Google form, if you have a spreadsheet that you work from our database, but kind of walking through having required pieces that you need to know in order for follow through, but other things that are completely open-ended. This can be anonymous reporting as well. So the way that this operates, the way this is connected is you can then search for, if you know, an ID number, including yourself. So this form allows for somebody to self-report and say, I've been affected. This allows for somebody to say, hey, I'm a faculty or staff that are reporting as referral on behalf of the student I'm talking to. But allowing folks to self-identify. And so under selecting experiences, it's also you, the person impacted. You could also be identifying, if you know, who it is that has been impacting you. So let's say it's between folks in a residence hall. If it's their neighbor, they can identify that individual. It's important for us to keep record. Is that's the first time that some folks have found some concerns about homophobia or transphobia or racism or what have you in terms of language, or is this the 10th time? And there are obviously different responses and accountability that may not come from me, but may come from other folks. So that's helpful for us to know if folks are willing or even able to share if they know. Sharing a little bit about their own narrative. One of the things here is, are there other kind of referral agents that have already been a part of this? So let's say a police department already knows about this, or student conduct already knows about this. We often work in our silos, even at a small institution I've been to before, that we don't always talk to each other. We don't always share, hey, I know this student is experiencing this. I know this student is experiencing the same thing. It's important for us to be talking. And if we know, hopefully in advance, that other folks are in the loop, I can reach out to my partners and say, okay, I know that this student has reached out to you. I know that obviously I'm not going to interfere with an investigation, but know that I've received this report, so I'm going to reach out to them to center them. Are there things that I should know going into that conversation, or are there things that I should then deter for you because ultimately you're in charge of an investigation I'm not going to have an impact on, making sure that open communication is there. The last question I added more recently, and I'm very glad I did, was really about outcomes for the person that's reporting, is ensuring that as somebody's reporting a situation, that their centeredness also is, what are they looking for? Are they looking for just to be noted, this is an anonymous report, I want you to know that there's a concern. A professor said this really off-kilter statement in a Zoom call, and I'm upset about it, but I also don't really want to be identified because of feeling like that could come back on me. That's a different scenario than somebody who, hey, I have this friend who says these really nasty things. I really do want to have a connection with them, but I want to be supported first, have a conversation with somebody, and therefore at the end, maybe the possibility is there's some kind of restorative practice that we can engage in. Again, very divergent in terms of power, in terms of outcomes, allowing folks to have that autonomy to say, this is what I'm after in this situation. So those are the forms. I mentioned kind of centering. These are just a few ways in which we do that. Charlotte really went through these, so you kind of stole my thunder. I appreciate it. Kind of the trauma-informed response. Acknowledging that our very virtual settings now, but I think globally we're going to see more and more folks that try to engage either mostly through email, maybe some through Zoom, that making sure that our messaging, it's so easy for us to get caught up on using an email and just finding that to be the only method by which we communicate, because it is quick, because folks maybe see that more readily, but inviting folks into conversation if they're willing to share in a one-on-one. You'd be surprised. I didn't think this would work for me, frankly, but inviting folks into a conversation about the trauma they've experienced over a one-on-one Zoom call has actually been a far more successful experience than I thought it would be. That folks have felt very validated, that the body language, the affect that I bring into the space, the caring, the nurturing, that despite it being that I emailed them to reach out and connect with them first, that they have felt that even if I'm not in person, there's still some humanity that's seen through the screen, and that folks then want to have a follow-up. I found that most of the folks I've talked to have had such a good experience that they've sought after me weeks, months later to say, hey, I know that, you know, we talked about this other situation, but I have a friend that has this. Can I talk to you about it on Zoom? And that's, I think, where some of this comes down to centering folks in a way with your language, with your body language, that enables them to feel empowered. As much as I can reinforce the kind of counseling tools that folks do with active listening, with nodding the head, with the hands gestures, enabling folks to know that you're engaged with them, that you're sympathetic, empathetic, and compassionate for them, but also providing options that they have and acknowledging where your power limitations are. So in a lot of the conversations I have with folks, they're like, well, I want some end result in this. And I say, well, again, in terms of accountability measures, I'm willing to engage with the faculty or the student that has harmed you. But I'm not a student conduct office. I am not, folks in the police department. But are you interested in me engaging them with you as an advocate, as somebody's alongside for the ride, to ensure that you are centered in that conversation if you do seek after their services? Some of them take me up on that, and some say, no, I'm happy for them to just, the person that's impacting me, to know that you're involved in this and that you're advocating for me. So thank you. But knowing those limitations for the student is so important, so they don't expect that at the end of all this conversation, they think that a faculty member is going to be fired, or they think that a student is going to be suspended, because that's not likely going to happen. Most of the times that these bias incidents are not hate crimes. They're very offensive, they're very challenging, they're very hurtful, but that doesn't make it a situation where they're against policy or law. And so I think that piece where sharing your limitations, actually, as much as it sounds depowering, it's actually empowering, because it allows students to know you are transparent about what you can and can't do, and still nonetheless feel affirmed. Empowering rest and self-care when possible. This is something more and more I caution myself even saying, but for everybody, self-care looks different, and it's not always a, hey, I'm going to go take a walk and get a breath of fresh air. That's wonderful if you can. First of all, that's ableist if somebody can even walk. Secondarily is for folks that are actually engaged in this, just showing up to this space may be all that they can bring. For them afterwards to take some breaths, wonderful if they can. But for folks to just say, oh, somebody in my role says, oh, well, afterwards, make sure you can, treat yourself to massage or a spa. Well, we're not going to do that with COVID, clearly. Nonetheless, even if you did it for yourself and you're trying to, oh, well, okay, reading and listening to music, I think that those are helpful tools for me, but maybe somebody else, it's not that. Maybe they want exercise. So I think we want to be careful as we're engaging and empowering that rest and self-care, not to go to the tried and true, well, you do this because it works for me. You do what's best for you, and how can I support you and what that looks like. That, again, is empowering. That's acknowledging what it is that they need, not what you might need. All right. So this is, again, a sample for what I've recently developed for reporting program. Going back to teams, this is something that was made as a team, that my comms person that works within my department created. What's on the left. The text is actually on the right. This is accessible because on our website, we don't just have the left side, which is nice and bubbly and pretty and colorful. This is the way that a lot of folks, at least for me, I like to kind of show and demonstrate our kind of more flow chart. That's not just a direct line of sight. There's these options that are available. But on the right side is the other text-based version. So for folks who have screen readers, the left side's not going to work for them. It's all not going to make sense. It's not linear, but making sure that as we're making documents as a team, we're also creating accessible documents when we can. Same thing with closed captioning, all these things that we're not reinforcing bias and isms as we're trying to support and center students. So again, this is another example for you to take a look at if you'd like. One thing that I very recently launched, I mentioned about dashboard, a lot of COVID dashboards are out there. Some folks, they don't put something out themselves out there. They may not report out regularly what it is that's going on for the campus for a lot of reasons. I acknowledge that it can be very challenging. For me, I found it's very essential, and frankly, our students require of it. They are holding us to account into what is going on campus. So I have a sample here where all this is really managed and navigated by individuals that sign on. So anybody who has a University of Maryland account can sign on here, can navigate all the data. They can look at the left side where it says the identity. They can sort it by different identities. They can download the Excel. I'm not hiding anything. They can sort from the date ranges. So if they want to look over the course of several months, the entire semester, over just a few days, they can look at that. It's filtered by location or report type. So if it's written versus verbal, location, if it's at the res hall, is it online, is it a classroom building? Enabling, again, it's tools for empowering folks. This is already tough stuff. Why are we making it harder for them? Why are we making it difficult and trying to, in some ways, even if we're not trying to do this, seem like we're hiding something that is very embarrassing? In fact, this is a display to allow them to navigate it. And again, the log is really the down below, all the information more in a data format. I am interested in even changing the reports over time to say, how can we track week to week, month to month, showing folks to kind of see, okay, how have we been trending? Almost like the COVID dashboard might be, are we up and down in situations in October versus September? But these are some things just to, again, another example for folks as you're trying to report out to your community, an option that might work for you. This is our kind of BIS by the numbers end of year report. It's kind of a similar tone of here's some information in colorful format, the numbers that folks like. We try to use some colors and visuals too, but that way folks are not trying to dig into we changed it from being what was called an annual report, where it was like a 5-page document, you had to dig through a lot of text, to being a very visual. You can put this on Instagram, you can put this on social media easily. And again, it's not something to brag. We're not excited about the fact that there are 42 incidents logged, right? That's not a point of pride. That's a point of you deserve to know as a community member, and here's what we're doing to help to address that. And so some of the responses on the bottom right. Here's the kind of identifier so you can know it is predominantly race and color all of last year, and even more so than this year. So again, another example, a visual display as a part of a team, my comms person is awesome. I do all the content, they make it look pretty. I don't get credit for this one. So again, sharing some more resources. I want to leave a few minutes here at the end. This is a resource that I did develop along with my comms person. They did the visual about providing clickable links, providing, this is called the GRACE model. Grace, I put you on the spot on all these things. I just love you so much that I want to make sure that you're front and center in my work. But the idea that grace, as the word grace, as we're providing grace, we're also responding in grace. And so getting ready, I admit, we kind of forced the acronym because it was initially prepare. But I was like, no, we want G. Get ready. It's the same thing. And then report and respond and report, acknowledge, communicate, for us, educate, making sure that folks are seeing it's a full roundedness, and it continues the circle. You know, there are folks that may say, I'm now acknowledging, but now I'm coming back to getting some education information, but now I'm ready to report. Maybe initially I just told you a little about it, but I'm not submitting a formal report until after I know some more information. So again, circular, this is another resource for you all provide on our website as well. A ton of resources. You're not gonna be able to go through all these right now. I've barely been able to go through all these. And there's a second page. So there's a ton of information out there. I've been busy with lots of webinars and panel discussions and articles. This work, to the point earlier, Audrey, that you're making of not having a dedicated, this in itself, just researching this is a full-time job. And so for me, I've provided these resources acknowledging I'm still learning through this, but I want to make sure that it is something that all folks have access to. So I've compiled all this. I've tried to kind of delineate some of the identifiers they're in, make sure it's all clickable so folks can get to them. Not have you search for them yourself. They'll be provided at the end. So we have a few minutes here. I want to open it up for any further questions. I'll come to the chat really quickly, but also acknowledge that folks may want to have a verbal exchange. Any initial questions for you?
I have a question, Brian. I may have missed it at some point, but for your bias dashboard, is it like self-reports? Is it like RAs when they report, or police reports? Like, what kind of reporting goes into that?
All. So anybody who reports to my office, so this has just been within the last month. There's been 26 since July 1st. This includes anybody who reports to me into my office, not necessarily, you know, so if let's say another office on campus hears of something, but they don't pass that along, this is not including them. So we have a Title IX office, OCRSM as we call it, Office of Civil Rights, Sexual Misconduct. They may get a complaint, and it may be that I hear about it months or weeks later. That then goes in the dashboard if I hear about it. But otherwise, it's what I receive first and foremost. It's what I'm also trying to encourage that folks report so that I can then track that and make it accurate. Let's readily acknowledge right up front that this is not enough. This is not depicting everything that's going on. Just because I'm not hearing about it doesn't mean it's going on. I'm sure that it's 10 times of what I'm receiving. However, by me putting it out there, more people then see, oh, this is the place I would report this to, so it could show up. And some of the students that I've talked to said, oh, I was looking for, I'm trying to hold you accountable, I'm looking for the date that I shared this with you. I didn't put any specific details because I'm not outing the person reporting to me, but I put details enough for the folks to understand the identities, the method by which somebody was impacted, but it wasn't to then put them out there to the larger community, because it could be that retaliation is a concern, that they feel like they're at a power differential between the person they've reported against. All those concerns may persist, but this is just what I have received. Good question. Other questions or topics to address?
I have a quick question. I may have missed this earlier, but do you allow like fully anonymous reports on that reporting form?
Yes. So I probably did it quickly when I was walking through the form. You can fill in your name, but you don't have to. It can be completely anonymous. There obviously are challenges where if it's completely anonymous, I have no tracking to be able to follow up, and they ask for follow up. That's obviously not possible if I don't know who they are. But it is completely anonymous. I've had several folks that have reported on behalf of somebody on campus, and they didn't want to put themselves out there, but they at least have said, here's the person that's impacted. Please don't follow up with me, but at least know that this person is impacted over here. At least know this situation happened in this classroom. So I do add that to our log for sure, but in terms of response, there's limited.
And are you receiving any pushback of getting this onto like your main college website?
So we made the active decision. This was actually before my time. Before a dashboard, we had a previous very clunky, almost like police blotter spreadsheet that we put on as a report, and it didn't look great. It wasn't very easy to access. But when I made the dashboard, I basically used the same rules of somebody still needs to log in with an account from the university. This is not for public consumption. I mean, I guess technically recorded is for your consumption, but the idea that this is not meant for like social media blasts and accessing this from any old stranger. This is not meant for folks that are in the media that they just want to go and tab information about University of Maryland and say something negative about them. It's more of the folks that are in our community who are impacted need to know. The faculty, staff, the students, the folks that have an account. So you still have to log into your, when you click the link, it doesn't just immediately put up the dashboard I showed. It's more of you have to log in, get in, and then as a result, you have open access at any point. So it was an active decision. I go back and forth with it myself, like how much information is also something we can put a report, because we do at the end of the year, the annual report or BIS by the numbers. That's public information. That's a summary information anyway. Anybody has access to that. That's just clickable PDF. So that was kind of the baseline of we're having internal information initially as it goes, and then external, that's our annual report that everybody sees. Pop in here onto chat just in case there are questions on here I didn't see. Thank you, Charlotte, for some information about your bias response team. And Taylor, thank you as well. Yeah, athletics is another partner. It's someone that I did not add for the extra, but maybe should have. I caution back and forth about how sometimes that can be, it's kind of a good at arm's length, making sure it's involved because of, as somebody noted earlier, having a lot of students of color that are in athletic teams to have the impact, that buy-in from coaches. But I also know that the politics involved in that and them being on can also be a tricky dynamic because it's not meant to be, I will say my experience, most folks within athletics are not seeing this as how do we be trauma informed and support people and center them. It's more of, I want to make sure my team is protected because I don't want my athlete to be suspended.
Ryan, if I could offer one thought, one of the initial questions was about, or comments was about the sort of on a small campus and sort of trying to start a team. And I think many McCuho schools are small and struggle with one person wearing many hats. And certainly I can say an experience we have had is the challenge of navigating folks who have responsibilities in multiple areas because that's all we have, or because of vacancies or whatever. And sometimes we have students who have had interactions with us in some contexts that may not have been positive to them, for them in their perception, and then have a situation where we might be the ones that are then those who would respond, and they have a sort of see it through a lens based on this previous context. So I just think that's a reality of a smaller campus and something to consider if starting a team, having that conversation about how do we kind of, the student is always our student, regardless of what their previous interactions have been with us or with policies or anything else. So how do we help and make sure we're accounting for that in our planning and in our follow-up and communications with them?
Excellent point. And Grace, as you know, I've worked for several smaller schools, and in doing this work, because frankly, I've been doing this work for some time, but really as a second or third or fifth hat that I was wearing as a means to support students. And it's very true. There are a lot of students that I talked to in prior years, prior campuses, where my being in charge of conduct, being in charge of RAs, being in charge of who knows what, a student group, whatever, they have a different perception of me. I may be able to, maybe, if I'm at my best, be able to take that hat off and put the other hat on and be able to center a person as I'm sharing it now. And even then, they're seeing the same person. So ultimately, how does that interaction, how is it framed? How is that person walking into that space? There are layers here where you cannot change who you are. And so if that's your role, it's about just acknowledging that and saying, I know that we've seen each other, or maybe you know of me as in charge of conduct, or you know of me as in charge of staff training, or whatever fill in the blank situation that they might have encountered you. Nonetheless, naming that allows that power to say, I am trying to transition this, continue to be engagement with you if you're willing to. That's assuming they even come. But before doing that, one of the things that I do recommend as you're framing your teams or maybe tapping other folks, that's where the student advisory group piece comes in, getting some student buy-in. Even if as you're exploring, I know resources are tight, but even if exploring somebody who does not have a power dynamic that would on its face seem like they would be, that a student would be resistant to talking to you about this. So maybe it's somebody from a counseling center. Maybe it's somebody as a grad assistant in a D&I office type of thing. If they can then be that intro point, maybe not, they're not the person maybe managing all of the bias response, but if that can be their entry into this conversation, their centering can look different than if they're perceiving, I'm going to the person in charge of conduct, I don't want to get in trouble, even though I'm reporting something that, by the way, it's biased, but I was drunk and so I can't say this. These are the kind of scenarios, as I'm sure you're alluding to, Grace, that the power in that moment can be a deterrent for students to come to you.
Brian, just want to be mindful that we're out of time.
Oh, so sad. Good conversations. So again, thank you one and all for being a part of this conversation. Again, the recording will be available for folks for the next 90 days after we put it up on the site, on the platform. And then all these resources I'll make sure are also available to you. And you can private email me as well. I'll have, yeah, my last slide, perfect. I think that Sam also did it. If you want to do evaluation, my email address, please contact me directly if you want any materials before they get uploaded online. I can share that immediately. And even just to engage in dialogue if there are folks that really just need some additional support one-on-one. I'm happy to be here for you. Thank you one and all, and I hope that you're able to find some peace. And as I say, self-care in whatever way that is for you, some radical rest for today, for the weekend and beyond. Thank you again, one and all, for being here.